instructors released predator cubs in the lecture hall. They climbed into the human's lap to sleep. Code Crimson, all units to Lecture Hall 7. We have a Class Alpha breach with multiple apex predators and civilian casualties imminent. Senior combat instructor Zilax's claws scraped against his console as emergency klaxons shrieked through the Galactic Military Academy's xenobiology wing. His yellow eyes fixed on the tactical display, showing the impossible. 6 apex predator cubs from 3 different death worlds: vegan shadow stalkers, Rigelian bone crushers, and Andromedian void hunters, all curled up peacefully in the lap of graduate student Amelia Johnson, who was continuing her thesis defense presentation as if nothing unusual was happening. And as we can see from the behavioral data, Amelia's voice carried clearly through the comm system, interspecies communication patterns often rely on universal care signals rather than species-specific dominant structures. Could someone adjust the volume on that alarm? I can barely hear myself think. Zilax's jaw dropped. The cubs, each capable of dismembering a fully armed Korthak warrior, were making what could only be described as purring sounds. The vegan shadow stalker, barely 3 months old but already sporting retractable claws that could slice through battle armor, had rolled onto its back in Amelia's lap, exposing its vulnerable belly in a display of complete trust that violated every known principle of predator psychology. "Sir," Tactical Officer R. Hill's voice cracked through the comm. "The auto-defense systems are locked down. The cubs' presence triggered maximum threat protocols, but they're not attacking." "I can see that," Zilax snarled, his own predator instincts screaming at the contradiction before him. How did they even get out of the containment chambers? The Rigelian bone crusher cub, its armored carapace still soft with youth but already capable of crushing steel, nuzzled against Amelia's arm as she gestured toward her holographic display. Its massive head, designed by evolution to crack open the skulls of megafauna, rested gently against her elbow while she explained the finer points of cross-species empathy recognition. The training exercise was scheduled for 1,400 hours in the combat simulation chambers, R. Hill reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The cubs were released simultaneously across 3 different secure environments for advanced tactical assessment. Instead of engaging the hollow targets, they just left their chambers and came straight here. Straight to her, Zilax breathed, staring at the human who was now absently scratching behind the Andromedian void hunter's audio receptors. The void hunter, a creature evolved in the vacuum of space to hunt ship crews through ventilation systems, was making a sound that registered on their instruments as contentment. Emergency blast doors sealed the lecture hall from the outside as combat teams took position in the corridors. Through the reinforced transparasteel, Amelia looked up from her notes and waved cheerfully at the gathering crowd of heavily armed military personnel, xenobiologists, and increasingly frantic academy staff. "Oh good, more audience members," she called out. "I was worried my defense committee was getting bored." Now, as I was saying about the correlation between species-wide stress responses and environmental caregiving behaviors, the vegan shadow stalker stretched lazily in her lap, its razor-sharp claws retracting completely as it settled more comfortably against her legs. Its siblings from different worlds seemed to sense its contentment and moved closer to Amelia, forming what any military tactician would recognize as a protective formation. Except they were protecting her from the rescue teams, not threatening her themselves. "This is unprecedented." Dr. Kaeldra, the Academy's chief xenobiologist, appeared at Zilax's shoulder, her scientific instruments already scanning the impossible scene. Predator cubs from different evolutionary chains don't exhibit cross-species pack bonding. It's genetically impossible. Their hunting instincts should have triggered the moment they detected each other's pheromones. Tell that to them, Zilax growled, watching as the Rigelian cub gently headbutted Amelia's hand when she paused in her petting. She laughed, actually laughed, and resumed the stroking motion along its armored ridges. Could someone please turn off that alarm? Amelia's voice carried a note of mild irritation. It's really disrupting the cub's nap time, and cranky babies are never fun to deal with. Babies. She called the most dangerous juvenile predators in known space babies. The tactical display updated with new readings that made no sense. Stress hormone levels in all 6 cubs were at their lowest recorded measurements. Heart rates were steady and calm. Brain activity showed patterns associated with deep relaxation and security. Patterns that these species only displayed in the presence of their own parents, and only in the safety of their home territories. Sir, Communications Officer Jataro's voice wavered. Admiral Vex Thule is demanding a full situation report. The emergency protocols have automatically alerted High Command that we have an active predator breach with civilian casualties. Casualties? Amelia's voice carried clearly through the comm as she looked up from where she was gently repositioning the Andromedian Void Hunter so it wouldn't slide off her lap. Who's hurt? Do we need to call medical? I have basic first aid training if someone's injured. The cubs stirred slightly at the concern in her voice, their heads lifting to scan for threats to their protector. Finding none, they settled back down. But now their positioning was even more obviously defensive. 3 different apex predator species, natural enemies of each other, had spontaneously formed a unified protective unit around a single human graduate student who thought the biggest problem was an inconveniently timed fire alarm. Get me a direct line to High Command, Zilax ordered, his military training warring with the evidence of his own eyes. And somebody find her thesis advisor. If we're going to die today, I want to know what her research was actually about. Within minutes, the corridor outside Lecture Hall 7 resembled a war zone command center. Emergency response teams arrived expecting to find a massacre, and instead found themselves staring through blast-resistant windows at what could only be described as the galaxy's most dangerous nap time. Ma'am, we need you to very slowly move away from the hostile entities. Captain Korvax spoke through the intercom system, his voice carefully modulated to avoid triggering predator hunting responses. He'd spent 20 years dealing with escaped apex predators. This was his specialty. Amelia looked up from her notes, where she'd been highlighting key passages while the Vegan shadow stalker used her free arm as a pillow. Hostile? These little ones? They're just tired. Don't you have somewhere they can properly nap? This lecture hall lighting is way too bright for quality sleep. The captain exchanged glances with his team. Little ones. She was calling creatures that had killed seasoned warriors during their capture. Little ones. The entities you're referring to are Class Alpha Apex Predators. He tried again, pulling up his standard predator psychology manual on his tactical display. They respond only to dominance displays and fear conditioning. You need to establish yourself as the alpha presence immediately, or... His words died as he watched Amelia gently lift the Rigelian bone crusher, a creature that weighed nearly 40 kilograms, and resettle it more comfortably across her lap so it wasn't putting pressure on the Void Hunter's tail. The bone crusher made a sound that their translation systems couldn't process, something between a purr and a sigh of contentment. I think you might have some outdated information, Amelia said cheerfully. Has anyone actually tried just being nice to them? They're clearly just babies who got scared and confused in a strange place. Look at how they've calmed down now that they've found someone who's not shouting or waving weapons around. Dr. Sinara, the Academy's senior predator behaviorist, pushed through the crowd of military personnel. She'd written the definitive texts on apex predator psychology, trained hundreds of handlers, and had never seen anything like this. Miss Johnson, I need you to listen very carefully. Those creatures are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to view any non-parent as either prey or competition. The calm behavior you're observing is likely a hunting strategy. Oh, come on, Amelia interrupted, absently stroking the shadow stalker's head as it shifted. In sleep. Look at their body language. Relaxed muscle groups, steady breathing, content vocalizations. This is basic mammalian. Well, mostly mammalian, comfort behavior. They trust me. As if to prove her point, the Andromedian void hunter stretched, revealing its full wingspan of razor-sharp appendages, then carefully tucked them back against its body to avoid accidentally scratching her. The movement was deliberate, controlled, protective. That's impossible, Dr. Sinara breathed. Void hunters don't possess the neural pathways for trust recognition with foreign species. Their brain structure. Maybe your brain structure research needs updating, Amelia suggested mildly. These babies are demonstrating pretty clear emotional intelligence. Watch this. She made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, and all 6 cubs immediately oriented toward her, their eyes bright and alert. Good morning, sleepyheads? Everyone feeling better after your nap? The unified response from 6 different species shouldn't have been possible. Their auditory processing systems were completely different. The Vegan shadow stalker communicated primarily through electromagnetic frequencies. The Rigelian bone crusher used subsonic vibrations. The Andromedian void hunter relied on echolocation patterns. Yet, all 6 responded to Amelia's simple vocal greeting with what could only be interpreted as happiness. Sir, Tactical Officer R. Hill's voice was strained. I'm reading something impossible on the biometric scanners. The cubs' stress hormones are continuing to decrease, but their alertness levels are increasing. They're becoming more aware of their surroundings while simultaneously becoming more relaxed. That's the paradox we've never been able to solve. Dr. Sinara muttered, her scientific worldview cracking with each passing moment. High alertness plus low stress is the theoretical optimal state for learning and development, but we've never observed it in apex predator species outside of their natural family units. Well, you're observing it now, Amelia pointed out reasonably. Maybe the problem isn't with them, maybe it's with your approach. When you were cubs yourselves, did your parents establish dominance through fear conditioning? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about predator psychology. Captain Korvax activated his emergency protocols. This was beyond his training, beyond anyone's training. Command, I need immediate consultation with the Galactic Council's apex predator specialists. We have a human who appears to have domesticated 6 Class Alpha predators using unknown methods. Domesticated? Amelia sounded genuinely offended. I haven't domesticated anyone. They're just comfortable. There's a difference between respecting someone's autonomy and making them feel safe. She looked directly at the camera feeds. You do realize they can probably understand everything you're saying about them, right? How would you feel if strangers were discussing you like you were dangerous objects instead of thinking beings? As if responding to her words, the cubs shifted positions. Not aggressively, but definitively. They moved to face the windows, where the military personnel were gathered, their young faces alert and intelligent. Waiting. They're listening, Dr. Sinara whispered. not just reacting to environmental stimuli. They're actually listening to the conversation and processing the implications. Of course they are, Amelia said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. They're babies, not mindless killing machines. They want to understand what's happening around them, just like any other intelligent species would. She paused in her notes and looked up at the gathering crowd. Has anyone contacted their parents? They must be worried sick. The arrival of the Galactic Council's emergency response team transformed the corridor into something resembling a military operation crossed with a scientific conference. Admiral Vex Thule materialized via emergency transport alongside Dr. Zoranix, the Council's foremost authority on predator species management, and a full tactical assessment unit. Situation report, the Admiral demanded, his 4 eyes scanning the tactical displays that showed biometric readings that shouldn't exist. 6 apex predator cubs from 3 different death worlds have spontaneously formed a protective pack around a human graduate student. Zilax reported, his voice tight with the strain of describing something that contradicted every military doctrine he'd ever learned. Standard containment and extraction protocols have proven ineffective. Ineffective how? Dr. Zoranix demanded, already pulling up his comprehensive database of predator behavioral patterns. He'd spent 3 centuries developing the psychological frameworks that every military academy in the galaxy used for predator management. They won't respond to dominance displays. They've rejected territorial challenges from their own species, and they appear to have adopted the human as their pack leader. Isn't the right term. Pack protector? Pack beneficiary? Through the transparasteel, they could see Amelia had somehow produced a thermos of hot chocolate and was taking small sips while continuing to read through her thesis notes. The cubs had rearranged themselves into an even more obviously protective formation, with the larger Rigelian bone crusher positioned to intercept any approach from the main entrance, while the more agile shadow stalker and void hunter covered the alternate access points. This is tactically impossible. Colonel Dirax, the tactical assessment specialist, muttered as he analyzed their positioning. Different species can't coordinate defensive strategies. They don't share tactical languages or formation protocols. Tell that to them, Admiral Vex Thule growled. What's her background? Special Forces training? Xenopsychology specialty? Advanced Predator Handling Certification? Graduate student in theoretical xenobiology, Zilax replied, consulting his datapad. Her thesis is on universal care recognition across species barriers. No military training, no predator handling experience beyond theoretical coursework. Her academic advisor describes her as enthusiastic about babysitting anything that moves. Babysitting? Dr. Zoranix repeated flatly. She thinks she's babysitting Class Alpha Apex predators. Excuse me. Amelia's voice carried through the intercom as she looked up from her notes. Are you the people in charge? Because I really think we need to discuss proper care protocols for these little ones. They're clearly not getting adequate nutrition or social stimulation in whatever facility you've been keeping them in. The assembled experts stared at each other. She was critiquing their predator management programs. Miss Johnson, Dr. Zoranix activated the intercom with the patience of someone addressing a particularly naive student. Those are not pets. They are apex predators whose species have terrorized entire star systems. Each one of those little ones comes from a world where survival depends on killing everything that moves. Well, that explains why they're so stressed and defensive when you treat them like monsters, Amelia replied matter-of-factly. Of course they're going to act out if you approach them expecting violence. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. She gently stroked the shadow stalker's fur as it stirred in sleep. They're just babies who've been traumatized by being separated from their families and treated like weapons instead of children. Children? Admiral Vexthul's voice carried a dangerous edge. Those children have killed 17 of our most experienced handlers during capture and containment operations. Because you were trying to capture and contain them instead of communicating with them, Amelia pointed out with the kind of logic that made military commanders break things. How would you react if aliens kidnapped you, threw you in a cage, and then acted surprised when you fought back? The cubs stirred at the tension in the adult voices, their heads lifting to assess potential threats to their protector. The bone crusher made a low rumbling sound that every predator specialist recognized as a warning, while the void hunter's wings shifted position to provide additional cover for Amelia. "See?" Amelia said, noticing their movement. "They can sense when the adults are getting agitated. You're making them nervous with all this aggressive posturing." "We are not," Dr. Zorinex began, then stopped as he realized that yes, they were engaging in threat displays. Aggressive postures, raised voices, territorial positioning. Everything their training said to avoid around apex predators, they were doing instinctively in response to the impossible situation. "Miss Johnson?" Admiral Vexthul tried a different approach. "What exactly did you do to achieve this bonding?" "Nothing special," Amelia shrugged, careful not to disturb the sleeping cubs. "They showed up during my presentation looking scared and confused, so I made space for them to sit down. They were obviously tired, so I kept my voice calm and let them rest. Basic childcare, really. Basic childcare," Dr. Zorinex repeated, his worldview cracking further with each word. "You applied basic childcare principles to apex predators." "They're apex predator cubs," Amelia corrected. "Cubs are children, regardless of species. The principles of care, safety, and emotional security are pretty universal across intelligent species." She paused to consider. "Well, I'm hypothesizing they're universal. This is actually excellent data for my thesis." Colonel Dirax was studying his tactical displays with growing bewilderment. "The cubs are exhibiting coordinated behavior patterns that suggest advanced strategic thinking, but their stress indicators show they're in a state similar to what we'd observe in domestic pets during optimal care conditions." "Because they're experiencing optimal care conditions," Amelia said patiently. "They're safe, they're comfortable, they're not being threatened or treated as dangerous. Of course, their stress levels are low." "But the coordination," Dr. Zorinex started, "is what you'd expect from intelligent social beings who want to protect someone they care about," Amelia finished. "They're working together because they've decided I'm worth protecting, not because they're planning to attack anyone." As if to demonstrate her point, the shadow stalker opened one eye, assessed the continued presence of the gathered military force, then deliberately yawned and went back to sleep. The gesture was so obviously dismissive of the perceived threat that several officers unconsciously stepped backward. 3 centuries of predator behavioral research, Dr. Zorinex whispered to himself. 3 centuries, and a human graduate student just talked to them. "I didn't just talk to them," Amelia corrected, having overheard through the sensitive comm system. "I listened to them. There's a difference." She looked directly at the cameras. "They've been trying to tell you what they need this whole time. You just weren't paying attention to the right signals." Admiral Vexthul realized that everything they thought they knew about predator species management was about to be rewritten by a human with a thermos of hot chocolate and a thesis on theoretical childcare. "All right," Admiral Vexthul said, after a moment of silence that stretched across the corridor, full of military and scientific personnel. "Miss Johnson, would you be willing to explain your approach in detail? For the record." "Sure," Amelia said cheerfully, carefully shifting her position so she could access more of her research notes without disturbing the cubs. "Though I should warn you, it's going to sound pretty obvious once I explain it." Dr. Zorinix activated his recording systems, preparing to document what might be the most significant breakthrough in interspecies relations in galactic history. "Please, proceed." "Well, it starts with basic observation," Amelia began, one hand absently stroking the shadow stalker's fur. "Every intelligent species we've encountered shows similar patterns in their early development phases. Young individuals require security, consistent care, and social bonding to develop properly. The specific methods vary. Some species need temperature regulation, others need specific vocalizations, some need physical contact. But the underlying need for safety and nurturing is universal." She paused to take a sip of hot chocolate, completely unaware that she was delivering a lecture to some of the most powerful military and scientific minds in the galaxy, while 6 apex predators used her as a combination security blanket and fortress. "The problem with your current protocols," she continued, "is that you're treating cubs as miniature adults instead of recognizing them as developing children. When you approach them with dominance displays and fear conditioning, you're activating their survival instincts instead of their social learning systems." "But these species are non-social," Dr. Zorinix protested. "Adult apex predators are solitary hunters with minimal pack structures." "Adult apex predators, yes," Amelia agreed. "But these aren't adults. They're children who've been separated from their caregivers and thrown into an environment where every interaction tells them they're in danger. Of course, they're going to default to survival behaviors." The Rigelian bone crusher stirred at the sound of the discussion, lifting its massive head to look directly at Dr. Zorinix through the transparisteel. For a moment, the scientist found himself staring into eyes that showed unmistakable intelligence and what looked remarkably like judgment. "See that?" Amelia pointed to the interaction. "He's evaluating whether you're a threat to me. Not whether I'm a threat to him, but whether you might hurt me. That's protective behavior, not predatory behavior. These cubs have formed attachment bonds." "Attachment bonds with a different species," Admiral Vexthul said slowly. "Cross-species attachment bonds that shouldn't be possible according to our understanding of evolutionary psychology." "Maybe your understanding is too limited," Amelia suggested diplomatically. "I've been working with the hypothesis that care recognition signals are more universal than we previously thought. When I started my research, I spent time with younglings from dozens of different species, not as test subjects, but as a caregiver. Babysitting, essentially." "You've been babysitting alien children?" Colonel Dirax asked, his tactical mind trying to process the implications. "Well, yes. It's great research, experience, and honestly, most species have surprisingly similar needs when they're young. Food, safety, attention, playtime, comfort when they're scared." She gestured to the cubs. "These 3 species all showed identical stress responses when I first encountered them in controlled environments. Elevated heart rate, defensive posturing, hyper-alertness. Classic symptoms of children in unfamiliar situations without trusted adults." The shadow stalker made a soft chirping sound and nuzzled against Amelia's hand. She responded automatically, scratching behind its audio receptors in exactly the right spot to make it purr. "How did you know to do that?" Dr. Sinara demanded, her scientific instruments recording the interaction. "Same spot that makes Centauri kittens purr," Altarian puppies wag their tails, and vegan domesticated mammals relax their muscle tension. Amelia replied. Most species have nerve clusters in similar locations that respond positively to gentle stimulation. It's one of those universal care signals I mentioned. Dr. Zoranix was rapidly cross-referencing his databases, and the results were making his head spin. Miss Johnson, are you suggesting that basic caregiver behaviors transcend species barriers? I'm not suggesting it, Amelia corrected. I'm demonstrating it. These cubs responded to the same calming techniques I've used with dozens of other species. Soft vocalizations, non-threatening posture, consistent gentle contact, and most importantly, treating them like the intelligent individuals they are, instead of the monsters everyone expects them to become. The Andromedian void hunter stretched its wings, revealing the full span of appendages that could slice through starship hulls, then carefully folded them back without coming anywhere near Amelia. The control and consideration in the movement was impossible to ignore. They're adapting their behavior to avoid harming you, Admiral Vexthul observed. Of course they are. They're not mindless killing machines. They're children with excellent motor control and social awareness. They understand that their natural movements could accidentally hurt someone they care about, so they modify those movements accordingly. Amelia looked up at the cameras. Honestly, they're better behaved than most of the adult researchers I work with. The implications were staggering. If cross-species care bonding was possible, if apex predators could form protective rather than predatory relationships with other species, if the galaxy's most dangerous creatures could be reached through basic childcare principles. Miss Johnson, Admiral Vexthul said carefully, would you be willing to work with our specialists to develop new protocols for predator cub management? Only if you stop calling it predator management, Amelia replied firmly. They're not problems to be managed. They're children who need appropriate care. And only if we focus on reuniting them with their families, instead of keeping them in containment. The cubs stirred at the mention of families, their heads lifting with obvious hope and longing. The emotional intelligence in their response was unmistakable. We don't know how to safely return them to their homeworlds, Dr. Zoranix admitted. The political complications alone. Then we figure it out, Amelia said simply. Because keeping children separated from their parents isn't science, it's cruelty. And if you want my help developing better care protocols, that's non-negotiable. Admiral Vexthul looked at his senior staff, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their expressions. Everything they'd built their careers on, predator psychology, containment protocols, military doctrine regarding apex species, was being gently but firmly dismantled by a graduate student who thought the solution to dangerous alien predators was better childcare. All right, Miss Johnson, he said finally. We'll discuss repatriation protocols. In the meantime, would you be willing to continue your research under controlled conditions, with proper support and resources? Can I finish my thesis defense first? Amelia asked. I've been working on this presentation for months, and honestly, this is the best practical demonstration of my theoretical framework I could have asked for. The cubs seemed to sense that the tension was resolving. They settled back into comfortable positions, their protective formation relaxing into what looked more like a family gathering than a tactical defensive unit. Dr. Zoranix realized he was witnessing the birth of an entirely new field of study. Not predator management, but interspecies child development. Not containment protocols, but care methodologies that could revolutionize how they interacted with every species in the galaxy. Miss Johnson, he said quietly, I believe you're going to pass your thesis defense. 3 months later, the Galactic Military Academy's newest required course, Universal Child Development and Cross-Species Care Protocols, was being taught by Assistant Professor Amelia Johnson in a lecture hall that had been completely redesigned to accommodate both traditional students and what the administration diplomatically referred to as juvenile research subjects. The Cubs, now officially designated as cultural exchange participants, rather than contained apex predators, had their own section of the classroom with comfortable resting areas, toys appropriate to their developmental stages, and direct communication links to their families on their respective homeworlds. The political negotiations for their repatriation had transformed from a series of tense military standoffs into enthusiastic cultural exchange programs once the parents realized their children were not only safe, but thriving. Now, as we can see from this week's behavioral data, Amelia said, gesturing to holographic displays that showed stress hormone levels, learning, capacity measurements, and social development indicators. Young vegan shadow stalkers demonstrate increased cognitive flexibility when provided with environmental enrichment and positive social interactions. The shadow stalker in question, now nearly twice the size it had been during the infamous thesis defense, looked up from where it was carefully playing with a puzzle toy designed to challenge its problem-solving abilities. It made the soft chirping sound that Amelia's research had identified as a request for attention, then proudly displayed its completed puzzle. "Excellent work, Zara," Amelia said, using the name the Cubs' parents had provided during their first video call home. "Your pattern recognition skills are improving remarkably." In the observation deck, Admiral Vexathul watched alongside Dr. Zoranix as military cadets took careful notes on techniques that had reduced predator-related incidents by 97% across all Academy training programs. The fundamental shift from treating young apex predators as threats to treating them as students had revolutionized not just their educational protocols, but their entire approach to interspecies relations. "The Rigelian embassy has officially requested that we expand the program," the Admiral reported. "They want to send more Cubs for cultural exchange education." "And the Andromedian Council?" Dr. Zoranix asked, watching as the Void Hunter, now called Kix by its family, demonstrated its ability to navigate complex, three-dimensional puzzles without damaging the equipment. Full endorsement. They're calling it the most significant breakthrough in peaceful interspecies cooperation in recorded history. Admiral Vexthul paused. "They're also asking if Professor Johnson would consider establishing a permanent research station in the Andromeda system." Through the observation window, they could see Amelia sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by military cadets and her 3 research assistants. She was explaining the finer points of cross-species comfort signals while Zara demonstrated the proper technique for non-threatening approach behaviors with a volunteer cadet. "The Bone Crusher's family wants to know if we have any human children who might be interested in cultural exchange," Dr. Zoranix added with something that might have been amusement. "Apparently, young Thok has been teaching his siblings some of the social cooperation techniques he learned here." "Human children visiting a Rigelian death world," Admiral Vexthul mused. 6 months ago, I would have called that a war crime. Now it's a diplomatic opportunity," Dr. Zoranix finished. "Professor Johnson's methodology is being adopted by educational institutions across 17 different star systems. The demand for her consultation services is overwhelming." In the classroom, Amelia was packing up her materials while the Cubs gathered around her for their end-of-session cuddle time, a practice that had initially horrified military observers and was now considered an essential component of healthy development for young apex predators. "All right, everyone," she said to her mixed audience of military cadets and alien children. "Remember, Your homework is to practice the active listening techniques we discussed today. And that goes for both the two-legged and four-legged students. The cubs made their various species-appropriate sounds of agreement, while the cadets filed out, chatting excitedly about their observations and comparing notes on interspecies body language interpretation. Professor Johnson, a first-year cadet, approached as the classroom cleared. My family back on Tau Ceti has been having some difficulties with their neighbors' younglings. They're Epsilon Eridani migrants, and the cultural differences are causing some tension. Do you think your techniques might work for inter-colony community relations? Amelia looked up from where she was scratching Thok's armored ridges, considering the question. Well, the fundamental principles should apply. Children are children, regardless of where they're from. Send me the details, and we'll see what we can figure out. As the cadet left, looking hopeful for the first time in weeks, Admiral Vexthul reflected that the galaxy had become a remarkably different place since a graduate student with a thermos of hot chocolate had taught them that the most dangerous creatures in the universe just needed someone to treat them like children instead of monsters. The revolution had been remarkably quiet, he thought. Most of the best ones were.